Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, the program where I talk about comic books, cartoons, and comic book conventions. This is episode 138. All past episodes can be streamed or downloaded from the program's website, davetalkscomics.com. In addition to the program's website, this podcast can also be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and Facebook. You can find my notes on what I have read at davetalkscomicsnotes.blogspot.com. On this episode, I will continue my coverage of Heroes Con 2017. This is the third part. This episode is made up of two recordings I made at the end of the second day of the convention, where I talk about what I bought, people I talked to, the panels I went to, and what I had to eat. So day 2 of Heroes Con is for the most part over. I still haven't eaten dinner yet. I'll be going out to do that pretty soon. But I wanted to record a little bit at least about how the day went. To begin with, actually, I had a few random thoughts from yesterday, things I probably should have mentioned when I was talking about the first day of the convention that I scribbled down this morning when I was getting ready to go back to the show. The first thing was the Kirby Museum is there, and they have some gorgeous prints. These are prints of pages from comic books like Eternals and some of the Fourth World stuff and some of the other, I think even some Fantastic Four pages. And they're beautiful, but they're $60 a piece, and there's no way I'm paying $60. And the prints are also a little bigger in size than what I usually like to buy. I want something that's going to fit in a book that I have, a portfolio that I have, and these things were huge. I think they're even bigger than 11 by 14, maybe even bigger than 11 by 17. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the Heroes Con t-shirt. The last couple years, I've bought a Heroes Con t-shirt. 2 years ago, I got the Indie Island t-shirt. I can't remember the name of the character on it. I didn't bring it with me this time. It's something Future Girl or something like that. Apocalyptic Girl. I think that's what it was. But it was a maroon t-shirt with either white or yellow design on it, and I thought it was pretty neat. I wasn't as crazy, I think. I can't even remember what the Heroes Con t-shirt was that year. But and then last year it was the Black Panther, which is actually the t-shirt that I wore today, the Black Panther t-shirt done by Brian Stelfreeze. This year it's the Tellos, Tellos, which was a comic book that was originally done by Mike Wieringo, who died probably about 10 years ago at this point, possibly even a little over 10 years ago. The only thing of his that I've read really is I got very interested in his run on Fantastic Four that he did with Mark Waid, which was coming out about the time that I started to collect comic books again back in late 2002, early 2003. And I have like the first 5 or 10 issues of that series. It's all available on Marvel Unlimited. I really do want to go back and read that. In fact, I started to go back and read that, but I don't think I got any further than the first couple issues. So the design on the t-shirt is nice, but what I don't like about it, and this is a problem that I had with at least one other year, and that's the coloring. I don't know who picks the colors for these t-shirts, but they pick a color which blends right into the color of the t-shirt, and I don't know why they do this. It kind of hides part of the design. They did this with the t-shirt design that Jaime Hernandez did for Heroes Con a few years back, and I really liked that design, but I hated what the colors did to the look of the t-shirt. So it's like part of the design blends right into the background, and I think it doesn't work at all for the t-shirt. I think it really, you need something that pops out. You don't want something that fades into the background. So I'm not going to get a t-shirt. I wasn't too crazy about the Indie Island t-shirts this year, and I didn't like this t-shirt, and so I think I'm just going to end up passing, and I probably won't get any t-shirts this year, at least at Heroes Con. Maybe at Baltimore later this year if they've got a design that I like. And in fact, I even got asked by one person, a woman stopped me asking me about the T-shirt. I think she probably wanted to buy it for her husband or her son, because she had a little kid with her, and so she asked me about where can I find that, and I was like, well, this was last year's T-shirt, and they've got a different design this year, and I don't even know if they're selling it. So the third thing that I wanted to mention, and this one isn't really a closed point at this point, and that's magazines. I looked around, I dug through comic book bins the last couple of days, but I have yet to find much in the way of fanzines, or what I have found has been kind of pricey and not what I wanted to pay, and not even necessarily what I was looking for. Although I'm certainly up for getting some of those pricier ones, I just don't want to pay the high prices for them. I mean, some of them were like $40, and I'm definitely not interested in paying that much. Maybe $5 or $10 if it's something that's really hard to find, but I'm not interested in paying $40 or more for some of these fanzines from the 1970s. But I probably will look for more of those tomorrow. So I didn't go out for breakfast today. They don't have breakfast, as part of the deal at the hotel I'm staying at. But I did have 3 bagels left over from Boogers, where I got my bagels from yesterday. So I had 1.5 of those bagels, and then I also had some of the chocolate ice cream I had left over from last night. And that was basically my breakfast today. I left the hotel around probably 9:10, 9:15, and I went to a nearby Harris Teeter, and I got some food for lunch. I got some pita bread and some chicken salad, and then I drove into the convention. And that's what I had for lunch today. But before I had lunch, I did a little more walking around on the show floor. I stopped back at the last place that I bought comics yesterday. The name of the dealer is Comic Kings. I dug through their boxes from about B through D, and honestly, I could have stayed there for considerably. I don't know how long I was there for, but I'm sure it was over a half hour. I could have stayed longer, but I just decided I'd spent enough time. I wanted to walk around. I wanted to look at some other stuff. But I picked up 6 comic books from them this time. I bought Daredevil 190. These were all dollar comics. I bought Daredevil 197, which is the first appearance of Lady Deathstrike. I got interested in this character after reading, I believe it was Uncanny X-Men 205, which was drawn by Barry Windsor Smith, and I'm sure was written by Chris Claremont. This is the Wounded Wolf story, which I picked up after reading about it on somebody's blog a few years back. I think I talked about this on the podcast way back when, probably 2 or 3 years ago, about Wounded Wolf. And that got me interested in Lady Deathstrike, and I tracked it back, and I found out this was her first appearance. This was the first story she shows up in. And I was actually interested in getting Daredevil's 197 through 201. I believe this is between the 2 runs that Frank Miller had. I believe the writer was it? I think it was Denny O'Neil. Yes, I believe the writer was Denny O'Neil, and I don't recall exactly who was drawing the book, but I think I can look that up, and I probably should know who it was. Okay, the pencilers for this issue are listed, according to Comic Book DB, as Larry Hama, Klaus Janson, and William Johnson. I guess I was aware that Larry Hama had done some pencil work. I haven't actually cracked open the issue and looked at it. I might have flipped through it briefly when I was buying it. Oh, and the inker, one of the inkers is Mike Mignola. Klaus Janson is always also listed as an inker, and so is Larry Hama. But this is the first part of at least a 3-part story. Bullseye is on the cover in addition to... I think this is the return of Bullseye. I think that's what this story is. This in the next 2 issues, because Bullseye was in a body cast around the end of Frank Miller's first run on Daredevil. So I got interested in reading this, and honestly, just over this weekend, I've been thinking about going back and rereading Frank Miller's first run on Daredevil, and then, at least blogging about it and maybe recording some podcast episodes about it. So that was just one of 6 comic books that I bought from Comic Kings. The other comics were, I bought 2 issues of Doctor Strange Classics that I found, and this is one of those reprint series. I read the first 12 issues of Micronauts in Micronauts Classic, I think it was. And that was like 5 issues, double-sized issues that reprinted the contents of the first 12 issues of Micronauts. So this was something similar that came out, of course, but these issues of Doctor Strange that they're reprinting are from the Ditko era. There was 4 issues of Doctor Strange Classics. I've got 2 of them, so 2 and 3 now. But I'll keep an eye out for the other ones. There was also an X-Men Classics that reprinted, and this is before the X-Men Classic series, which started reprinting all the new X-Men stuff. The X-Men Classics series reprinted the Roy Thomas and Neil Adams and Tom Palmer run, which only lasted about 9 issues or something like that. But they've got these gorgeous covers by Mike Zeck that I really love. I also picked up a couple issues of Crime Suspense Stories. Now, this isn't the original. These are EC comics, but these are not the original. These are the reprints from the early 1990s, issues 3 and 4. And I might not have picked them up, but they were in such gorgeous shape, and the covers were so nice. And I always love these kinds of stories from EC. I even started to open one up and started to read it earlier today, but I didn't get very far into it. I think because I was waiting for a panel, and then the panel began. And then I found one of the 3 issues that I'm missing of the Mike Zeck's run on Captain America. So from issue 261 to like issue 301, and I don't think he penciled all of those issues, but he penciled the majority of the issues in there. And it was also J.M. DeMatteis wrote most of those issues, but once again, I don't think he wrote all of them. And I believe those are the only 2 I'm missing. It's possible there's an annual that I should also be picking up, but I'm not sure. I know I have annual number 6. I don't know if annual 7 would also be considered part of that run. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the other 2 issues that I'm missing, which are 277 and 283. And then I walked around some more. I ended up digging through another dollar bin. I found a couple of issues of Flash that I've been wanting. This is from the run during when Paul Pelletier was penciling the Flash, and I think Mark Waid was writing it at that point. I think that was he'd come back to it, and I've got some of these issues. I found 2 of the ones that I was missing, issues 145 and 155. Sometime around then, possibly before then, possibly after, but certainly before I went to any panels, I went by Joey Weiser's table, and finally, actually I went by there twice. The first time there was people at his table talking to him, so I circled around, and I think that's when I bought some comics. But I came back later, and he didn't have anybody at his table, so I stopped there. We chatted for a bit. I reminded him that I had gotten a commission from him, or I had ordered a commission from him of Batman and the Outsiders. And it's Batman, Halo, Black Lightning, Katana, Looker, and Metamorpho. And those are not the original. Well, 5 of them are the original team, and Looker was not on the original team. And actually, the only story of hers that she shows up in that I've read was not in Batman and the Outsiders, and not in the Outsiders either. After Batman left the book and they retitled the book, but in an issue of Detective Comics, there's a story that she shows up in. I think for 1 issue, maybe 2. There was a story called The Mud Pack. And it was penciled by Norm Brayfogle, and the writer, I want to say, was Doug Munch, but I'm not sure if that's correct or not. But she shows up in that story, but I really like her design, and I'm not really crazy. The one character from the original team of the Outsiders that I left off was Geoforce, and that was partly for gender parity, because this way there was 3 men and 3 women, and partly because I thought that I like her design much better than I like Geoforce's. Geoforce is probably the most bland looking of the original team members. So I just asked for those characters. I knew he was going to do something interesting with them. And actually, I ordered this, I think, the same day that Adam West died, but I had not heard about that. I don't think I heard about it until, I believe he died on the 9th of June, and I didn't hear about it until the 10th. But, so he did it. So Joey drew this, and he has them all doing the Batusi, which is a dance that which originated on the Batman TV show. And from what I heard recently, I think it was the most recent episode of Gilbert Gottfried's podcast, where they were kind of doing in memoriam to Adam West, the Batusi actually showed up, I think, on the pilot, on the very first episode, or the very first story, because quite often those were two-parters of the Batman 1966 TV show. So I'm very happy with what he did. I really like it. This is probably at least the 4th piece that I've gotten from him, and very happy with it. I was thinking at this point about going upstairs because there was a panel that I wanted to go to at 12:30, but I walked around a little bit and then I ran into Mike Myers from Geek Brunch. I was heading towards the exit. I wasn't right at the exit, but I was heading in that direction when I ran into Mike. He was kind of walking my way. I think he was looking at his cell phone, or he was looking at something else, maybe some books that he had, and he wasn't looking up. And I said, "Hey, Mike," and then he stopped, and we shook hands, and we started to talk. And then Bill Bomer, who's one of his co-hosts on the Geek Brunch, on the regular, who is his, I guess one of his co-hosts on the regular Geek Brunch podcast. There's another co-host, but I don't think he's on very much anymore. I think I've heard him on the show once or twice, but I didn't listen to the show I haven't listened more than a couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years now I've been listening. So he came up, and then Daryl Taylor, I think it is, who does a number of podcasts, has shown up on Geek Brunch on occasion, and has been on a few other does another podcast or two with Mike. He came up, and so we all stood there and we talked for, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 minutes. It was probably about 20 minutes. We talked about some movies and some comic books, and I was showing Mike the print that I got, not the print, the sketch, the commission that I got from Joey Weiser, because I know that he's a big Batman and the Outsiders fan, and he's got some Batman and the Outsiders commissions that I really love, and I am jealous of. And this was the first Batman and the Outsiders piece that I got, so I had to show him that, and then I ended up flipping through the book and showing him some of the other things that I had. I can't recall. This is only the second time that I've met Mike. I think it was he thought it was 3 years ago at Heroes Con. I know it was at Heroes Con that I ran into him before, but I can't remember if it was 2014 or 2015 when I saw him before. But I flipped through the book and showed him. I didn't have every single page filled, but I showed him all the different things that I got. And so we talked for a while. We went through the book. Then we talked about some movies. He asked me if I'd seen the Death of Superman Lives film, which I had. And I think I even talked about that briefly on an episode of the podcast. And he also asked me, and then I asked him about the Island of Dr. Moreau documentary, if he had seen that. And so we were kind of talking about movies and about film. We didn't really talk about comic books too much. We were kind of talking about documentaries a bit. And so eventually, they went their way. They decided to continue to walk around. I was going up to this panel, and that's what I did. I probably went up there. I got there actually I didn't get there that early. I probably got up there around 12:15, and there was actually quite a few people already in the room at that point. The panel that I went to at 12:30 was Villains in Pop Culture, Psychology of Evil. This was hosted by Dave Verhagen, or Verhagen maybe, PhD. And the other panelists were Dr. Megan Connell, Dr. Craig Pullman, Dr. Frank Gaskill, and Michael Kritzer. Or is it Kreitzer? Maybe it's Kreitzer. And the description of the panel is heroes get to save the day, but villains make stories fun. This panel of psychologists will explore villains across the pop culture landscape. What makes them tick? How do they connect to their diabolical worldviews? And what are their weaknesses? What makes them intriguing to audiences? So it was not just a supervillains as in comic book supervillains, but it was villains across pop culture. So they mentioned things like Harry Potter. They mentioned television shows and movies that had absolutely nothing to do with comic books. There was a fair amount of discussion of comic books, but it wasn't just superhero comic books like The Walking Dead, the TV show came up. So they started by talking about how to rate, I believe it was Dr. Pullman talked about how to, he talked about the Stanford Prison Experiment, which is this experiment which I had heard about, but the way he first described it, I didn't understand, because he was talking about the person, the psychiatrist or psychologist who ran it, and I didn't recognize the name, but when he mentioned Stanford Prison Experiment, I knew exactly what he was talking about, in part because I had a teacher who did a very limited version of this in school with us when I was, I believe, in 10th grade. But what the Stanford Prison Experiment illustrated was that it doesn't take much to turn somebody evil. And so what he got into at that point, what he talked about for just a couple minutes, was the different things that describe the different criteria or the different tests of what makes somebody evil. You know, how far are they down this road or that road? Now, I taped this program, and I will be posting it, although actually this group does have a podcast, and so they may have been recording it themselves. I'm not sure. I didn't see any recording equipment, but it's possible that they were recording it. If they do, it'll probably be a better recording, even though I was in the front row, it'll probably be a better recording than I got on my iPhone, the same iPhone that I'm recording this on right now. And if that's the case, then I'll provide a link in the show notes. So I think the moderator did a very good job of leading the panel along, of asking questions and having them either go down the line and answer the question, or sometimes he would just direct a question at one of them. And some of the questions that came up were about the complexity of villains in pop culture, about what do villains reveal about the human condition, what role do villains play in stories? I mean, how necessary is a villain to a story? Does the villain always have to be the person who's causing the problem in a story? And what is lacking in some villains? And they got into a discussion of Catwoman. Dr. Connell talked a little bit about Catwoman and compared her. I thought it was very interesting. She compared Catwoman to Batman. They're both vigilantes. They're both motivated by revenge, and yet Catwoman quite often is seen as a villain more often than Batman is. And why is that? And what is it in the character? What is it in the environment that causes her to be seen that way? There's also a little bit of discussion of Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader, and what motivates him, and what led him to become a villain, and does he really see himself as a villain, and how he was portrayed across the various movies. There was another point that was brought up about the divide between, and this is something that I had not heard before, but the divide between Apollo and Dionysus, the conflict between the two, that Apollo represents order and Dionysus represents chaos. And they related this to some comic book characters, in that Batman would be Apollo and Joker would be Dionysus, because the Joker is the chaotic force in Batman's world, and Batman is the force that tries to impose order on the Joker and on Gotham City and on the villains who try to make Gotham City a mess or try to have their way. And then they flipped it around and they talked about how in Metropolis, Lex Luthor is Apollo and Superman is Dionysus. And so it was kind of an interesting discussion, and I'm not going to be able to recreate what they said right here. So if it sounds interesting at all, I'd recommend keeping an eye out for that, because I will be releasing that, or I'll be providing a link to that if they released it. They asked an interesting question about whether there's a problem with enjoying villains. They even polled the audience to see, who enjoys villains, or who can think of villains that they enjoy. And I certainly, my hand went straight up. And anytime anybody had a question, and they did take, like the second half of the panel was Q&A with people from the audience asking questions. They even took questions through Twitter. They gave a hashtag, and I suppose I could have sent out a question that way. But if somebody asked a question in the audience, they asked them to not only give their name, but also what villain do you like, or what villain do you think of yourself as, or what villain do you admire and why. And so I thought that was interesting. And nobody named my favorite villain, or the villain I like to think of myself as sometimes, which is, of course, Lex Luthor. They talked a little bit about archetypes. Different types of villains. The trickster villain, like the Joker. The revenge villain, like Catwoman, or I suppose there are others. The power villain, the one who just wants to take over, which I guess Lex Luthor could be an example of that, but the one that I thought of immediately was Darkseid. The panelists were asked, what villain would you be? And you got answers like Poison Ivy and Hannibal Lecter and Anarchy, who's a villain from Detective Comics that I've read his early appearances, and I was never really crazy about the character. Maybe there are better stories that involve him, but I didn't think very much of the character. The Kingpin was another, and the Joker was another one that came up, and I can't remember exactly who named which. I just wrote down the names of the villains that they wanted to be. There was a question about at what point does a character become a villain, and can a villain be selfless? And they talked about like Mr. Freeze, and here's Mr. Freeze who's doing this all for his wife, but he's killing people, he's causing great damage, and at one point being selfless is one thing, but just being selfless doesn't make you a good person necessarily. Because just because you're not conscious, just because you're not aware that you're doing evil, doesn't mean that you aren't evil. And they didn't really put it in exactly those words, but those were my thoughts that were going through my head when they were talking about this. What's the difference between an anti-hero and a villain? This is another question that came up. And they didn't talk about any specific examples, I don't think. And of course the first one that came to my mind was Vigilante, and I'm thinking of the Vigilante from the New Teen Titans comic book. I think that was Adrian Chase was his name. And that was a case of I believe he'd been a district attorney who became a vigilante because he felt like he wasn't getting enough, there wasn't enough justice. I can't remember exactly what motivated him. His first appearance was in the New Teen Titans Annual number 2, which I read way back when, but I don't have right now. And if I do this read-through of all those early issues of New Teen Titans, I will eventually get to that, but I know it's not in the first 3 collections. It may not even be until like either the end of the 4th or the 5th trade collection of the New Teen Titans. But my impression of that character is that he was probably, or the creators, Marv Wolfman and George Perez, were probably, or at least what I think of when I see that, is I think of the movie The Star Chamber with Michael Douglas and Yaphet Kotto, and there's probably some other recognizable names in that movie, but those are the 2 that stick out, that's about not a district attorney, but I believe Michael Douglas plays a judge who gets on the bad side of some cops who are enacting vigilante justice, who are taking the law into their hands when they see people getting off on technicalities. It's about 35 years old at this point. I remember seeing it once and not being too crazy about it, and then going back and watching it again. I don't think it's a perfect film, and I haven't seen it in quite some time at this point, but I think it's a pretty good film. Situation versus psychology, driving an individual to become a villain was another question that came up. And, then there was a question about what does our love of comic book villains say about us as individuals, the fact that we can associate with them. Does that mean that we're evil? Does that mean that we're bad? And then the final question was, are there any villains who are insane? And they're villains because they're insane. And I think there was an answer to this question, but I can't think of what it was. I think the Joker came up, but I think there was somebody else that came up. And I actually had a question that I kind of wanted to ask, but I couldn't quite formulate it. And this is something that came from the book Superman on the Couch, which I read, I think, probably more than 10 years ago, probably closer to 15 years ago at this point. And one of the things that came up in that book, which I believe was written by Danny Fingeroth, was that villains quite often, and I think this is probably more true in comic books than in some other forms of pop culture, villains quite often want to change the status quo. And superheroes more often stand for the status quo. I don't think it's universally true, but I think quite often it's true. But I was trying to think of how to formulate that into a question that I could ask the panelists, and I just couldn't come up with anything. But I think there's something there, and what occurred to me is that there are villains, because there are villains who, when the story begins, are already in control of the world, and the good guys are fighting back against the villains. You take an example like Star Wars, the original Star Wars trilogy. When I say original, I mean episodes 4, 5, and 6, of course. But in that story, the heroes are the ones who are renegades and are fighting back against the evil empire, as opposed to quite a few stories, like you take example of Daredevil, where the Kingpin is trying to take over. You take the example of Superman, where Lex Luthor is trying to take over. And so in those cases, the status quo is that law and order is the order of the day, I guess. Or the good guys are in charge. And so Superman wants to maintain the status quo. Whereas you take a case like Star Wars, or even something like The Lord of the Rings, where, well, I guess even in The Lord of the Rings, Sauron has not taken over yet, but he's threatening to take over. But another comic book that I talked about, and this is one where things are completely ambiguous, and I did do an episode on this, and that's Empire, which is a comic book by Mark Waid and Barry Kitson, in which the bad guy has basically taken over, or is in the process of consolidating his power. So I think that the situation can dictate what a superhero, whether a supervillain would stand for the status quo or not. And I think I've probably gone on long enough about this, and I should go on and talk about the next panel. Actually, before I went to the next panel, I had about an hour between panels. So I went out into the courtyard area, and I sat down. I pulled out my food, the pita bread and the chicken salad, and I had some of that. It only took me about 15 minutes to eat that. Didn't eat all the pita bread, but I did eat all of the chicken salad. And then I think, did I go back? Yeah, I think I went back and I sat in the panel room because it wasn't occupied at that point. And waited for the panel, and I just kind of updated my phone. I updated my comic book inventory on Comic Book DB to add all of the comic books that I'd bought so far. All the comic books that I bought today, because I'd already added the comic books I bought yesterday. And I, try to keep track of how much cash I spent and stuff like that. At 2:30, the Eisner and Kirby at 100, the mega panel for this year began. It ran for a little over 2 hours. And there was 4 parts to this panel. It was hosted by Ben Toll, Jenny Law, and Craig Fisher, I believe all of whom participated in the panel last year. And at least I know that Fisher and Toll I think they've been the ones behind all of the mega panels. And apparently this is the 10th mega panel they did. And they actually gave out an award to somebody that I know, John O'Brien, for being the only person to be there for all 10 mega panels. So they gave him a t-shirt, a Kirby t-shirt, which I believe was also available for sale at the Kirby Museum booth. The first two parts were on Eisner. The first part was kind of an interview, wasn't exactly an interview, even though it was billed that way, with Ben Toll talking to Tom Heinches about Eisner. Heinches worked with Eisner at Kitchen Sink Press back in the 80s, I believe, and 90s, according to the program guide. The 80s and 90s, interviewing Eisner. At that time, a lot of Eisner's spirit work was getting reprinted by Kitchen Sink Press, and Heinches' job was basically an editorial type position. He wasn't editing Eisner's spirit, but he was adding content to the book. So they would run letters in the book, and they would add extra material where Heinches would interview Eisner. I believe he said it was based on, he would read the stories that they were going to be running in that issue, and he would ask Eisner questions about them or about his work in general. And then they would add that, so that would give extra content to the book. I don't think I've ever owned any of those. I don't think I've ever read any of those. But this part of the panel, it wasn't much of an interview because for the most part, most of the talking was done by Heinches. And he kind of went through a lot of the old reprints and gave some commentary on what he remembered about them. He read passages from them of Eisner's answers to questions that he had posed to him. He talked about some of the stories and the importance or the themes or what he saw in the stories that he was talking about. And I wrote down some of the titles of the stories that he talked about and what it was about them that he wanted to emphasize. But I'm not certain I got all of these titles correct. But I'm just going to give a quick rundown of some of them. So there was Back Alley, which he emphasized the mood in that one. There was another story called Gerhard Schnabel, which I think I may have read. I'm not sure. I think this might have been the one that was included in the Smithsonian collection of comic books or whatever it was called that we had, my family had when I was a kid. And you can still find it online, used copies, for, I think, pretty reasonable prices. They may not be in perfect shape. It may not have the dust jacket, but I believe you can still find it. And there is a spirit story in there, and I believe that was my first time that I read the Spirit. And I really didn't read very much of the Spirit. Haven't read very much of the Spirit since then. At least, really not much of the Spirit at all. I was going to say not by Eisner. I have read the Spirit run that Darwin Cook did, but I mean that only lasted about 12 issues. That wasn't much longer than what I've read by Eisner. There was a Christmas story, and I don't recall exactly what the title of it was. Part of the problem with this panel was that the screen was off to the side of the room, and unless you were on that side of the room, and I was not, I was like in the middle of the room, you could still see the screen, but because you were looking at an angle, it made it a little harder to read what was on the screen. And to be perfectly honest, not all the type, it wasn't a huge screen, and not all of the type was the font, the writing was big enough or clear enough to read it. This was a Christmas story, and he talked about human goodness, and that was something that he felt was important to emphasize in this particular story, because Eisner, after all, was Jewish, not Christian, and yet he made a point of doing a Christmas story every year, apparently. So I'm not sure which year this was from, or what the exact title was. And there was a story called Lurid Love, and this was apparently kind of a parody on the romance comics of the time. There was a story called Satin, and in this one he talked about the panels per page, and the pages that he showed had like 10 panels per page, and he talked about how Eisner was trying to innovate, and he was really packing the story with information, and so once again, the emphasis was on the paneling throughout on the particular pages that he showed us on the screen. Lorelei Rocks was another one, and on this one he emphasized sound in comics, and there was something that I couldn't quite see on the screen that was going on there, that Eisner was doing some sort of a visual effect to create an auditory effect, I guess. And then there was The Meanest Man in the World. And in this one he talking about camera angles. But not just camera angles, but also the little things that Eisner would put into the comic to tell the story, the body language, he talked about the way the spirit would sometimes stick his tongue in his cheek, push out his cheek with his tongue, or the way he would stand pigeon-toed, and that this was something that Eisner did quite often to help to tell the story. And then finally he talked about the outer space spirit, which was not written or drawn by Eisner, although Eisner was still, I guess, editing it probably, or at least providing some sort of overall control on it. It was written by Jules Pfeiffer and drawn by Wally Wood at a time, this was very close to the end of the run of the Spirit, and he was trying to emphasize, Eisner's goal in not being the one who wrote it or drew it was to emphasize the continuity that the Spirit could go on, and which didn't exactly work because apparently he got a lot of kickback from the newspapers that were running the Spirit at this time, because they felt like they'd hired Eisner. They wanted Eisner's Spirit, and so his efforts were kind of for nothing, because he was trying to push the fact that the Spirit could live on, even if he wasn't the one writing it, but they didn't want to listen to that. The second part of the panel was, I thought it was going to be a dramatic reading of a story, a spirit story, but the story is called Meet Pagel. I always thought it was Pagel, but they explain that it's Pagel, and the reason why you know that it's Pagel is because her name is derived from a neighborhood in Paris called the Pigalle. And so that's how you know that her name is Pagel, not Pagel, even though it looks like it should be pronounced Pagel. This part of the panel was run by two college professors, Dr. Andrew, I wrote down the wrong name, Kunka, and Dr. Daniel Yezbik. And what they did was they talked about this story, and they talked about a lot of the visual imagery in this story, the use of curtains, the use of veils. They talked about the difference between the pre- and the post-war spirit. This story, I believe, dates back to, yes, in fact, they handed out a copy of the story to everybody that was there, a photocopied copy of the story. So it was in black and white. And on this photocopy it says, originally published October 6, 1946. So this was definitely a post-war spirit. And one of the things they said about the post-war spirit is that the stories at that time, the spirit became less the focus in the story and more of a host of the stories that take place. So he plays a role in the story, but he does not seem to be the central character anymore. Now, Pagel is a femme fatale. She's a character who is using men to get her way, but at the same time she isn't completely free to do what she needs to do. They called this the dirtiest spirit story ever. They gave some examples of why they felt it was that. They felt that they, being the two professors who were doing the presentation, of course, felt that Eisner wove in as much as he could. He pushed the boundaries as much as he could because he knew there's certain things he couldn't put in the story, but he still wanted to make it. He wanted to make it very suggestive, and it's much more suggestive without going over the line. But there's definitely from the way they described it, there's a very fetishistic element to this story. It has there's an erotic charge to it. There is imagery of the use of curtains and the way some panels are shaped have a vaginal look to them, and this is throughout the story. One interesting question that came up towards the end of this section of the panel was about Lauren Bacall, what the influences were for Pagel. And one of the audience members, who I believe took part in the next, I'm not certain. He was sitting in the row behind me, but I didn't get a good look at him at this time. But I think he might have been in the next part of the panel, which was on Kirby, not on Will Eisner. He suggested that this story came out in 1946. Well, that's a fact. But he suggested that, and another fact is that the movie To Have and Have Not came out in 1944, and he suggested that Lauren Bacall may have been an influence for the character of Pagel. Specifically her character in To Have and Have Not, which was, I think, the first movie that she did, the first of 4 movies that she did with Humphrey Bogart. And he pointed this out, and then Craig Fisher, who was taking questions from the audience at that point, also picked up on that. And I even added something to it, which neither one of them mentioned, which was that if you think about it, the name Pagel and the name Bacall aren't that far off from one another. So all of that is in the recording, and honestly, this panel was so long, I may break this recording into 2 parts. The first part being the part on Will Eisner, and the second part being on Jack Kirby. So that was basically the end of part 2 of the panel. We're probably I think we're a little over an hour into the panel at this point, or about an hour into the panel. The third part was a little more free-form. It was a panel discussion. They brought in 4 panelists, and there was 1 moderator. The moderator was Jenny Law, and the 4 panelists were Eric Larson, Jaime Hernandez, Gilbert Hernandez, and Steve Saffel. And they discussed Kirby. They discussed their influences, or their memories of Kirby, both his work and the man himself. They started off by talking about the first time they saw Kirby, or their earliest memories of Kirby. And it ranged from things like the monster stories that he did in the early 60s, to Captain America stories, to the Boy Commandos, which was actually a 1940s comic book, but in this case, it was Eric Larson who remembered the Boy Commandos, and it wasn't that he's old enough to have bought them when they first came out, but his father had a comic book collection, and so he was reading his father's old comic books. But then later he talked about like Commandy and some of the other stuff that he read when he was growing up. I think he's around 50. I'm not certain exactly what his age is, but he must be somewhere around there. And they went on to talk about a number of things about Kirby's artwork. They talked about Fighting American, which was a Captain America-like clone that they created, Jack Kirby and Simon and Kirby. Is it Jack? No, it's not Jack. Simon. I'm drawing a complete blank on what Simon's first name is. Yes, I am. I can't remember what. I think it was Bob. Jack Simon. It's not Jack Simon, and it's not Bob Simon. I'm not sure. Okay, but Simon and Kirby, he was a character they created. They talked about some of the gross monsters in there. They talked about some of the other monster books that he did later on for Marvel. Some of the monsters he introduced to some of the Marvel books that weren't monster books like the Fantastic Four. They got into a discussion of Kirby Crackle and what exactly it was, and how he created the effect. And they talked about how they, in their own works, especially Larson and the Hernandez brothers talked about, I think it was specifically Gilbert Hernandez, talked about trying to recreate Kirby Crackle and not being able to do it, not being able to figure out exactly what it was that Kirby was doing. Constant motion was another thing that came up, and this kind of relates back to something that came up during the presentation on the first day on storytelling that Jim Shooter did, when he talked about how Kirby would take these giant leaps from one panel to the next, that everything was like constant motion. And one suggestion that was thrown out in the discussion in this section of the mega panel was that the constant motion in the story was a function of the way Kirby would draw. That he was moving so fast in creating these books that it was just kind of in sync with him, that it flowed out of him. They talked about meeting Kirby, their memories of meeting Kirby, and the Hernandez brothers in particular talked about how awestruck they were and how tongue-tied they were, and how they never really had very much in the way of discussions, even though they met him a number of times. They never had much in the way of discussions. I guess they had trouble seeing him as a regular person. They just saw him as, they were so awestruck by his work that to meet the man, to see him that he's just a man, the way a lot of us are with some creators, that it becomes very hard to carry on a conversation, because we see the name and we associate it with images, and then you meet this person who creates the images, and sometimes you don't know how to communicate with them, because it's a one-way conversation. And now all of a sudden you're being expected you're being given the opportunity to communicate in the other direction. And you're lost, you're tongue-tied. And I've certainly experienced that, and it's probably part of the reason why I don't seek out creators to talk to them, because quite often I'm not sure what to say. And the conversation went on. There was a number of other things discussed, like some of his later creations, a character named Heidi Hogan, I believe, and there was some character who was supposed to be the size of a hat box. I didn't get down the character's full name. They talked about the demon as drawn by Jack Kirby and how it differed from the demon that has been drawn by other people, not to denigrate every every incarnation, and maybe even incarnation isn't the right word, but the subsequent renditions of the demon, but they were just wanted to emphasize that there was something different about the way that Jack drew and personified. I'm not sure exactly which one it was, really, but something about the way he presented the demon, they said, was different. I haven't really read. I might have one issue of the demon that he did, but I really haven't read his version of the demon, and I've read very little since then. Most of my take on the demon, I think, comes from the Justice League and the Justice League Unlimited cartoons. I've read a little bit of the demon, like I did read the Matt Wagner demon miniseries. It wasn't bad, it just didn't really inspire me to want to read a lot more of the character. Towards the end of this section of the mega panel, they also took questions from the audience about the legacy of Jack Kirby. The big legacy is, of course, the Marvel Universe and all the characters that he created. and all the stories that he told visually, the stories which have been retold over and over again, the most famous of which is probably The Coming of Galactus and the Silver Surfer. But there's also all kinds of great stories that he told in the Thor comic book series. And I guess that was really about it. It kind of wound down at that point. So that was the end of the third part. So they had one final part. At this point, it was almost 2 hours into the panel. I had plans to go to another panel, which I did go to, but it was pretty clear that I was going to miss the beginning of it. I decided to stick with the mega panel. So I did record the entire mega panel, and I think the audio came out pretty good. I have not gone back and listened to all of it just yet. But the fourth part of the mega panel was on 2001: A Space Odyssey, the 10-issue comic book, and actually it's 11 issues if you count. There was a graphic novel that was done, and this section was all done by Ben Toll. And he might have rushed it a little bit because he knew that we were really out of time or very short on time. And he didn't make any attempt to go through issue by issue, but he wanted to hit on certain points. And some of this went a little over my head, and I think that's because I really haven't read the 2001. I don't have the graphic novel. I just bought 5 of the 10 issues of the comic book series yesterday. Issues 4, 5, 6, 7, and 10. So he talked a little bit about the Treasury Edition first, about how the writing in it was not Jack Kirby's, but came from a draft of the script for the movie. He emphasized the fact that the comic book, it was kind of odd that the comic book came out when it did, because normally comic book adaptations show up at the same time as the movie. The movie, I believe, came out in 1969, and the comic book came out in 1977. Well, or at least it was 8 years later. When the comic, or maybe it was 70. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I think it was 77. I think it was. So I think the movie did come out in 69, but still, 8-year gap between the movie and the movie adaptation. So what exactly influenced that? My guess is Kirby's work on the Eternals and because I believe it started to come out after he started the Eternals. That's what I recall from reading the letters pages and the Marvel editorial pages in the Eternals issues when I read them recently. So it was probably that. It was probably also the Chariots of the Gods, and I think there was something in the air at the time. This was not something that came up during this discussion, during this panel. But Toll did go in and talk about what Kirby was doing and the kind of pattern that emerged in the stories that he told in 2001. I assumed that it was all one big story, the 10 issues, but apparently it is not. The last 3 issues are all about Machine Man. They are the initial appearance of Machine Man, issues 8, 9, and 10. Unfortunately, I don't have 8 and 9 at this time. Hopefully I'll get them sometime soon. Maybe tomorrow, but I'm not counting on it. The other stories vary. Some of them are one-offs, but they all seem to be, well, they seem to have quite a bit to do with the black slab from the 2001 movie. And if you listen to the recording of the panel, you'll hear the Toll describe, he gave a kind of a breakdown of how the comic books, the stories that ran in the comic books, what the progression of those stories was, and then how that progression changed as the series evolved, although it didn't evolve for very long because it only ran for 10 issues, and the last 3 were all about Machine Man. So that was basically it for the mega panel, the 2017 Heroes Con mega panel. And at that point, I ran down the hallway. It was about 4:45. The other panel that I wanted to go to was the All-Star Squadron panel. So I went immediately to the All-Star Squadron panel. I didn't even stop the recording. I just kept recording. So I have one big, long 3-hour recording, which includes the mega panel and most of the All-Star Squadron panel. And it ran from 4:30 to 5:30, so I've got about 45 minutes of the All-Star Squadron panel. When I walked in, they were talking about the artists. I believe they must have done something on Rich Buckler. They must have talked about Rich Buckler, who passed away very recently, who was the original penciler on All-Star Squadron, but they weren't talking about him at the time that I walked in. I should probably say something about who was on the panel. There was a moderator, which was Michael Urie of Tomorrows, and the other panel members were Roy Thomas, who wrote all of All-Star Squadron, and two of the penciler inkers, and those are Jerry Ordway, who's probably the best known of the penciler inkers. Well, certainly that was his first real work in comic. I don't know if it was his first real work, but it was his first big job in comic books. And the other penciler was Arvell Jones, whose name I recognize, but I really don't know anything about him I didn't know anything about him other than the fact that he had worked on All-Star Squadron. I may have seen his name on a couple other things, but I would be very hard-pressed to tell you what those things were. I wasn't as crazy about this panel as I was about some of the other panels that I went to. They told a number of stories. There was a lot of joking around. It didn't feel like this panel had as much direction as I would have liked it to. Some of the jokes I thought were, not all of them, there was a couple of them, though, that I thought were a bit infantile and unnecessary, but they got some traction from the audience when they made them, so I guess, although I don't think they didn't get any traction from me, but they talked about some interesting things. They talked about the fact that there was a lot of real people, or there was a certain number of real people who showed up in All-Star Squadron on a regular basis, and so they were asking the artists about the, reproduce, because FDR and Winston Churchill, for instance, and there were some Hollywood types, some actors and actresses who showed up in the comic book, and the question was, how difficult was it to have to reproduce them, and were there any rights issues in reproducing them? And then eventually they went on and they talked about more than just All-Star Squadron. They talked about Infinity Inc., the also another Earth 2 comic book that spun out of All-Star Squadron, in a manner of speaking, which was about the children of the Justice Society who existed in the present, but in their introduction, they time traveled back to World War II, which is when All-Star Squadron was set. And then there was this great story, the Generation Saga, which ran in the first 10 issues of Infinity Inc., and I covered on Dave Talks Comics back like around episodes, I think it was like maybe late teens through the 20s. I think I covered it in 3 parts, so on 3 episodes of Dave Talks Comics. Michael Urie also asked about before I get into that, they also mentioned that Infinity Inc., although they originally appeared in All-Star Squadron, there was quite a bit of changes that happened in the evolution of the team. And also that originally they were supposed to appear in DC Comics Presents, but for some reason that didn't work out, and therefore their first appearance wound up being an All-Star Squadron. Michael Urie asked about Crisis on Infinite Earths, which did kind of which ultimately was the death of All-Star Squadron, because All-Star Squadron took place on Earth 2, and one of the big effect of Crisis on Infinite Earths was to merge all the Earths together, so Earth 2 no longer existed. The stated reason for that was they felt like they needed to simplify things. Now, of course, since then, they've gone back, and there is a DC multiverse once again. I think that happened sometime in the last 10 years. And Roy Thomas basically stated that this was kind of the end of trust between himself and DC Comics. He said they said that if he could object, if he really felt like this was a problem, he could say something, and that they would find another way to do this. And he said that he didn't. But I mean, what were the odds that they were really going to listen to him and just cancel this whole big event series just because he wanted to preserve Earth 2 the way it was? And Jerry Ordway talked about he was supposed to be writing there were plans for him to write a Huntress miniseries, but this was going to be the original Huntress. Well, the Huntress who was of Earth 2, the daughter of Batman of Earth 2, Helena Wayne. And then, of course, that never ended up happening because there was going to be... Because I think at that point they probably had not created the new Huntress, which was Helena Bertinelli, which is the Huntress who I think still exists today, but I'm so behind on DC continuity that I could be wrong on that. They took a few questions from the audience, and one of the ones was, Roy didn't really remember anything about stories. Somebody asked if there was any stories that he wanted to tell in All-Star Squadron that he never got to tell, and his answer, I do wonder a bit how truthful this was, but his answer was he basically can't recall if there was any stories that at that time they didn't really plan things out years in advance. It was very by the seat of your pants, and there would sometimes be things that he would plan out, but for the most part he wasn't planning things out ways in advance. The All-Star Squadron panel wrapped up at about 5:30, after which I went downstairs to the showroom floor. I walked around a little bit. I went by Dave Wachter's table to see if the commission he was doing for me was done. It wasn't, so I'm going back tomorrow to try and pick that up. And that was basically about it. I think that I left at that point. I didn't buy anything else. The only money I spent today was I bought 6 comic books for $1 a piece. No, wait, 8. Yes, I bought 8 for $1 a piece. And I bought a book from Joey Weiser for my nephew, the first volume of his series, Merman. And that's it. That's all I spent today at the show. So after that, I walked back to the car, which I parked in the same lot that I parked in yesterday, about 2 blocks from the convention center. Once again, it was $10 to park. I drove back to the hotel. I, took a load off. I started to record this episode. Then I went to dinner, took a break. I went to dinner. I went to a rib place called Shane's Shack of Ribs or something like that, which I believe is a chain down here. I'd never heard of them before. Or maybe it's Shane's Rib Shack or something like that. I'm pretty sure it was Shane, and it was something about ribs in the title. And that's what I got. I got a half slab of ribs. The sauce was not spicy, but sweet. They were pretty good. I just felt like I had to have something. The other option I was considering was Thai food, and I have Thai food often enough at home. So I figured I wanted to try something different. I've had ribs a number of times when I've come down here. I believe I had them last year. I know I had them the first year I came down here. I know I've had them I think I've had them the last 2 years. Yeah, this is at least the 4th time I've gone out and had ribs at Heroes Con, and 6 Heroes Cons. So I felt like I needed to, and this is my last night here, so this seemed like the best time to go. And after that, I came back here and I started to record this section. The other thing I discovered when I got back from the convention before I went to dinner is that once again they did not clean my room. Nobody claimed the tip that I left out for them. So I guess I'll leave it out again tomorrow, and somebody will get it, whoever gets it. Presumably whoever cleans the room, because presumably they will clean the room before they provide it to somebody else. And I thank them for cleaning the room, but it's just $5. That's all the tip is. I would have tipped them $5 each day if somebody had actually come in and cleaned the room, but nobody did. I'm not sure if I needed to ask them to do that, but that's the way it is. So tomorrow I'm going back to the convention. The convention doesn't open till 11. It's the only thing that's really holding me that I have to do is pick up that commission from Dave Wachter. Other than that, I don't have any plans to go to any panels. There's none that really appeal to me. The only ones that really appeal to me are later in the day when I want to be on the road and leaving. I mean, like around 3 or 4 o'clock. I think the convention is open until 6 o'clock. But I really do want to try and be on the road by 3. It's probably going to take me about 8 hours to get home. It would be nice to be home before midnight. I think I'm going to stop and get some food, just like I did today, to have for lunch tomorrow. So that way I don't need to stop on the way out. Maybe I'll eat just before I leave. But I'll have the food with me so that I don't have to worry about where I'm going to eat when I decide to leave or whenever it is I decide to eat. So I think I'm going to do some more shopping tomorrow. I'm going to try and look a little more for magazines. It shouldn't be as crowded tomorrow as it was today. Although, of course, honestly, I wasn't down on the show floor all that much today, because at about 12:15 I left the show floor. I was down on the show floor from probably 10:15 to 12:15. 12:15 I left the show floor and I went up to go to panels, and I didn't come back down until 5:30. Yeah, until 5:30. So I have no idea exactly how crowded it got. It was certainly more crowded on the show floor by 12:15 than it was at any time I was down there on Friday, which is completely normal. Usually Saturday is the busiest day. I expect that tomorrow morning it'll be a bit calmer, be a better chance to go and do some shopping, be easier to walk around, and I'm definitely going to look and see if I can find some magazines. In particular, there's one issue of a magazine that came out probably about 15 years ago called Comicology, which has an interview with Paul Grist, who created Union Jack, that I want to read. So I think that's about it for day 2. I'm going to have some ice cream, which I have left over. I'm going to probably pack some stuff up, because, of course, I'm going to have to pack everything up. I can't leave anything here in the room because I have to check out before noon, but I will be well on my way to the convention center by then. So that's it for day 2 of Heroes Con 2017. As I listen back to what I recorded during Heroes Con, it's been a couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks at this point since Heroes Con, I noticed there's a few things I need to make some updates to. Uncanny X-Men 205, Wounded Wolf, I talked about that on episode 14 of the podcast. I probably didn't talk about it for more than about 5 minutes. There's a number of other comic books that I talk about on that episode, including the original Hawkeye miniseries, which is something I should probably go back and reread so that I can take some good notes on what I actually thought, because I really didn't have much to say about it back then. Simon and Kirby. Simon's first name was Joe. It was Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. I don't know why I couldn't remember that when I was recording. I don't know why I didn't go and check to find it, but it's Joe Simon. Paul Grist created a character named Jack Staff. He did not create Union Jack. Union Jack was created by Roy Thomas, and whoever the penciler was, I guess that was Frank Springer and Frank Robbins, who were the artists that worked on Invaders at that point. But Paul Grist created a character named Jack Staff. I've read the first trade of Jack Staff, the first 4 issues of that comic book. And I've bought the Image trade, which collects the first 12 issues of the comic book, and that's the original run of Jack Staff, which was printed by Dancing Elephant Press. It was printed in the UK. And I believe subsequently there was an Image, a series that Image did. I haven't read those. The original series was printed in black and white, and that's what the trade that you'll find. And I believe there's 3 or 4 trades of Jack Staff. But I was very impressed with what I read, and I wanted to read some more, and I wanted to read about Paul Grist, and there was an article in this issue of Comicology, which unfortunately I was unable to find at the convention, and the prices I've been finding online have been just a little more than I want to spend, but maybe one of these days I'll find it, maybe at Baltimore Comic-Con later this year. 2001, A Space Odyssey. Okay, so the movie came out in 1968. The Treasury Edition comic book, the one that started off the series, but it was not directly connected to the series, except in that it had the same title. It was also drawn by Jack Kirby, but as I mentioned before, it was not really written by him because I think the writing, as indicated by Ben Toll during the mega panel, the writing actually came from the script, or one version of the script for the movie. So the Treasury Edition comic book came out in 1976, and then the regular series also started in 1976, and the cover dates were from December of 76 to September of 77. So it wasn't quite as late as I said before. I think before I said 78, but still there was that 8-year gap between the movie, which came out in 68, and the comic book and the Treasury Edition, which came out in 76. That's it for episode 138. Episode 139 will wrap up my coverage of Heroes Con 2017. I will be talking about the third and final day and basically wrapping up my thoughts on the convention. Dave Talks Comics can be found at davetalkscomics.com, as well as on iTunes, Stitcher, and a few other locations. You can keep up with what I have been currently reading at davetalkscomicsnotes.blogspot.com and what I have been watching at smallscreenscrolls.blogspot.com. Links to both these blogs can be found at davetalkscomics.com under the Other Blogs header on the right-hand side of the page. If you have comments or questions, I can be reached at davetalkscomics@gmail.com, on Twitter @DaveTalksComics, or leave a comment on my website. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.